A road-going CLK is basically what you give to your third wife's housekeeper in, I don't know, Miami Beach, and it gets 5 miles a year, and it's silver, and nobody cares.
I'm sure the engineers were like, oh, now we have a real problem. The first one was like, oh, well, that happens. The second one was like, no, that doesn't just happen twice.
Engineers, team, maybe even other drivers are going, man, this Mark Webber is a real idiot. He's done it twice.
Right.
Because, I mean, the other part of this trend is it's the same driver.
If there was like a $10 million prize for being able to flip one of these things, how would I do that with my steering wheel and my controls that they've given me?
Okay, come on down to It's Not the Car Rodeo, where you'll pay for all the seat, but you'll only need the edge. Hi, this is It's Not the Car. We're a podcast. We are a podcast about motorsport and racing and motorsport. I'm Sam Smith. I am a journalist and researcher and a club racer, and I've worked for car magazines for a long time. And this past weekend, 2 days ago, I went to New York City on vacation, and I bought like 4 bags of Sour Patch Kids over 2 days. And that is your friendly piece of It's Not the Car trivia that is mostly useless, but also shines a light on how I'm a broken individual. You guys broken? You're broken, right?
I am definitely broken. In fact, my name is Ross He's Broken Bentley. And I'm a driver coach who I'm on the edge of my seat because I'm looking forward to this episode. I love these conversations. Although I do need some Sour Patch candy, so.
No, you don't. They make my teeth hurt, and I just keep going back.
Yeah.
Jeff doesn't strike me as a candy guy. Jeff, you a candy guy?
No, I'm not supposed to. I have to watch that.
I'm sorry. None of us are supposed to, man. It's
right. Didn't say I wasn't. I'm just not supposed to.
Jeff, I don't think there's, like, when you get the bag of gummy bears or whatever they are, they don't say you're supposed to eat this.
Right.
We literally.
Okay, I guess by definition, you're not supposed to.
Yeah.
The night before we left town, so Adrian and I get back, we were out at a bar with some friends, and then went to dinner, and then got back to our hotel, and there was a bodega like a block away, and Adrian wanted a bottle of water, and we walk in there, and we're like 2 people in our 40s at like 10:30, 11 o'clock at night, whatever it was, in a bodega in downtown Brooklyn. And I walk through, and I'm like looking through all the sodas, and I pick up some candy, and then pick up some more candy. And I walk up, and there's this guy, in front of me in line. And he orders a sandwich, and the dude behind the counter is like, yeah, blah, blah, blah. He wants this cheese, whatever. And he goes on, and he looks at me, and he looks down at what I put on the counter, and then he looks at me again, and he looks at my wife, who's standing there just like, looking like a normal person. He just laughs, shakes his head, because we had bought 2 bottles of water, 2 giant bags of Sour Patch Kids. And we walked out of the store, and Adrian was like, what are you laughing at? I'm like, he laughed at me. And she's like, why? And I said, because we're middle-aged people who just bought a bunch of candy in the middle of the night for no reason.
But you're washing it down with water, so that's healthy.
Right, it's healthy.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So on that completely useless digression, we'll digress again. So this episode is what we call our centerpiece episode. It's the monthly stop where we look into a story from racing history and tell the story. And then at the end of it, or in the middle of it, or sometimes, all in the beginning and the middle and the end, we unpack it, and Jeff explains things and Ross explains things. Sometimes I get to explain things. Now, I usually take the lead on this and tell the story. And the last one we did was on the Shelby Cobra Daytona Coupe. Now, I love that story. It's one of my favorites. I've got a personal connection to it. So the guys indulged me, and it went for 2 hours. And we were slightly concerned at the end of it. I mean, actually, I take that back. If they weren't concerned, I was concerned. I was worried that people would dig on this, but you guys did. And that was rad. We got a bunch of letters and comments saying, keep going. That was great. Please do more. And that was amazing. First off, thank you. Second, I don't know if this is going to be 2 hours or not. I don't know how long it would be. Ross swore he wasn't going to stop me if I started talking. We're just going to see where this goes. And most of all, it will be fun because we're talking about flying cars. And flying cars are always fun, except when they're not. And when they're not fun, usually the story ends up being fun later. And that's what this is, because in the moment when these cars flew, it was bad. And not like in the popular mechanics, we live in the future sense of flying cars, but in the sense that like these are really awful things that happened and no one ever wants them to happen again. But what's really cool about the story is that it's It's a tale that much of the internet and much of the world at the time thought was very simple, but is in fact slightly more complex. It's also one of those things that a lot of people get wrong. And really, to understand what happens or what happened in this moment, you need a basic kind of, ground level understanding of how air works, which is great because that's what most journalists have. And I'm a journalist, and that's where my understanding of air stops. But to make a long story short, in 1999, 3 Mercedes-Benz prototypes at Le Mans lifted into the air. One of them somersaulted more than 50 feet high, but they all went up, and they went up big. They did what's called a blowover. And these blowovers happened in one of the fastest sections of that big, crazy, rad track, right? 2 of them were in one place, and the third one was in a slightly slower place, but they were both really, really, really fast, creeping up on 200 miles an hour, right? Jeff, Ross, you guys good with this? Want to kick it off?
Yeah.
Let's take flight here.
Take flight. Yeah.
The dad jokes. Okay. So this.
I was thinking about blowovers. You used the word blowover. I was at the drag races hanging out with Clay Milliken, who was guest of the show. And I knew this episode was coming up, and I was looking at those cars, and they blow over too. And we'll maybe talk about the relationship between that and what actually happened. But so I'm all about, let's talk about blowovers. Not blowers, blowovers.
So to start with this, the race itself was in 1999, but we have to go back further than that, mostly for context. And as we often talk about on this show, context is always hung on people. Context in this case, and in so many cases, is just what was happening at the same time as something else was happening, what people did before, what people did during moments of pressure, and crucially, how all of those actions from the past, from the present, and all of that stuff influences whatever the hell is happening right now. And that influence is really just how we are pressured or not pressured as we make decisions, how we move in a moment of high conflict forward or backward or sideways in the wake of those decisions, right? It's always the wake. And sometimes that wake can be intangible. It can be, it can alter decisions without even, without you knowing that it's changing your thinking. It can make an event feel more important than it is during or after the fact, regardless of whether you acknowledge it. And in this case, with Mercedes-Benz at Le Mans in 1999, we need to go back to 2 points. First, to 1989 and 1990. So the company won Le Mans in 1989, and they won the World Sports Car Championship those 2 years running in 89 and 90. And that's important. Really, to get a sense of what Le Mans means for Mercedes-Benz, we need to go back even further to one of the most absolutely awful and earth-shaking moments in motorsport history. And that was in 1955. And we need to spend a few heartbeats on that moment because it was really just a few heartbeats in itself then that changed the company forever, changed Le Mans forever, changed racing forever. So, guys, I'm curious. When I say Le Mans in 1955, does that ring a bell?
Oh, yeah.
What do you got?
Oh, yeah.
What do you got?
Unfortunately.
Yeah.
I think it's been called sort of the worst crash or moment in all of auto racing history.
Right.
Yep.
Right. Jeff, what do you remember about it? I'm curious.
I remember thinking that a major manufacturer basically stopped racing and the impact it had, and that now that major manufacturer is one of the top racing manufacturers in the world, and how devastating that was for the company, but yet they came back from it and continued on.
Right.
After a long pause. I don't know how many years it was, decades probably, but
it was. Yeah.
It was it was a big deal. I mean, I heard stories about, it wasn't a big deal just for Mercedes. It was a big deal for racing. People were like, there was a big uproar about banning racing. Auto racing is too dangerous. Yeah. We should stop it. They should just cancel it completely. It should be against the law.
Right. And so all of that, you have to remember that in the middle 50s, cars were getting faster and faster. There were all these great big leaps of tech advancement that had come out of World War II that were being just thrown, almost fire hosed at motorsport. The cars, they didn't get I'm tempted to use the word exponentially, right? But they didn't get exponentially faster. They just got massively faster every year, and they didn't get any safer. Like to the point where by the middle 50s, cars at Le Mans were creeping up on a buck 80, buck 90, right? 190 miles an hour in tube frame, sometimes not. Surrounded by sheet aluminum or fiberglass. Absolutely nothing. So yeah, Ross, what's up?
And the Mercedes, wasn't it had like the body was built out of some weird material?
Yeah.
That contributed to this whole thing and the fire and burn. Yeah, like
right.
So the car burned for hours apparently.
Yeah. So this is a deeply conservative company. And in 1955, in June of that year, during the running of Le Mans, one person made a mistake, and then another person was caught up in that mistake, and then very many innocent people died. So we will do a show on this at some point because it is one of the most interesting and unpackable moments in all of racing history. But to make a very long story short, essentially a magnesium-bodied prototype, what we would now call a prototype, it was just called a sports car then, a Mercedes-Benz 300 SLR. It was involved in kind of a altercation with a much slower production-based car. That Mercedes goes into the stands. It slices into the crowd. It catches fire. More than 80 people are killed. More than 100 people are injured. Mercedes-Benz pulls out of motorsport. They're in the middle of one of the biggest, most successful runs anyone has ever seen in motorsport to date, and really since. And fault hadn't been determined, and the source of that accident wasn't immediately obvious, but they immediately withdrew from Le Mans. They do what we now call shuttering the garages, where you close the shutters and the garages are done, you're out, right? But they basically shut down their efforts. They shut down every motorsport effort they had. They got out of Formula One. They got out of sports cars. They got out of anything that even remotely resembled a speed pastime. And it was such a terrible moment that it hung like a pall. It cast a pall over anything the company did in motorsport for decades. And again, we talk a little bit about this period in one of our earlier episodes. It's the Sterling Moss Mille Miglia episode from earlier this year. But this was a big, important time for the company because at the time, Germany in the 1950s was still reeling from everything that had happened in World War II. And set aside the meaning of national pride relative to World War II. You have an entire group, an entire nation of people who were essentially, had zero sense of pride in who they were, what they could do, what was possible. And one car manufacturer, in a lot of ways, changed a lot of that. But long story short, that accident happens. Mercedes-Benz doesn't really touch motorsport for decades. There are privateer efforts. They quietly fund a bunch of studies and sports cars and things that never see the light of day. There's research, but in the public face, they don't do much until the 1980s. And there are two moments in the 1980s that really very tentatively help rebuild the company's approach to motorsport and really kind of open the gates again for them to start doing what they do. And what they do really, really, really well, like so many German manufacturers, is take a problem and just fly that thing down to the ground until it is solved. So the first of those moments in the 80s was they went touring car racing. They developed a car called the 190E 2.316. It was a four-door sedan. It was based on a production car. It was a production car, homologation special, meant for touring car racing. It was extremely successful in the 1980s, led to the development of the first BMW M3, led to the German horsepower wars in the 1980s and 90s, set off, basically 20 years of those two companies battling again the market, right? There's that one. The second thing was that Le Mans win in 1989 that I mentioned earlier. In 89, they won Le Mans with a Group C prototype. And this was in one of the feistiest eras of the sport, this period when, Porsche with the 962 and 956 before it, these prototypes, they had essentially dominated endurance sports car racing for years. They had become the solution to the question. So much so that, grids seemed at some points, you could look across grids in Europe and they would be almost nothing but 962s. Because they were customer cars, they were just the answer. So when Mercedes won in this whole period, when nobody expected it, it was just this huge emotional moment. It was more than 30 years after that Le Mans accident. They had only just started dipping back into motorsport. But to kind of condense all that, Le Mans means something to the company then. It means something to the company even now when they have not been there in years and years and years. There is probably no other manufacturer on the planet that has a stronger emotional tie to that place. Save Porsche, right? And we all know why Porsche cares about Le Mans, blah, blah, blah. That story's been told 1,000 times. The Mercedes story doesn't get told as often because it's not as big and sexy. And also, frankly, Mercedes-Benz isn't as sexy a company, right? It doesn't come out of a barn. It's not family. There wasn't Ferdinand Piëch. There wasn't all these infighting. But in the wake of that, it's almost like the company got some semblance of, Stella groove back, right? And in the 1990s, they got into, they started throwing money at more things, right? And that brings us to something we've talked about on this show before, which is FIA GT road racing. And in this case, the GT1 class, the highest level of that championship. It was fastest cars, the most technology, the most spend, the sexiest, largest manufacturers, right? So Jeff, like the Corvettes you guys run in IMSA, they're in a GT class. That's GTD, right? What does GT mean to you? What does that term mean for you?
Oh, wow. It's varied over the years. I mean, GT racing, those cars, the current GT3 cars we run resemble the street car. But somebody told me not long ago that on our Corvette, AWA Corvette, there are something like under 10% of the parts on that car are found on the street car, like the headlights are, the taillights are. There's some other parts, but quite a few of the engine components are, but that's about it. So, but there was a time when GT racing was even crazier than that. They were like silhouette cars. It was basically like take a current LMP2 car, take that body off and put a silhouette body of a Ferrari or a Porsche or something on top of it, just so it kind of like looks like it, but underneath it's a pure out prototype. And the GT1s of those days weren't GT cars. They were prototypes. Right. I mean, we raced against them with our Ferrari 333, which was a true prototype, and we raced directly against that Porsche GT1. And they weren't kidding anybody. That was a prototype.
Yeah. So the GT term itself, right? So that used to be a class of car on the road, and it was a genuine class of production car. Described just kind of it was a big, broad, all-encompassing term. Those letters mean grand touring, and that idea at one point was represented in it. There was a vast difference between what people called sports cars and what people called GT cars. GT cars typically had long legs. They were fast. They handled well. They were packed with feedback, but they weren't the most nimble things in the world. That often meant, a really expensive production car full of cutting edge technology, was designed and engineered by some of the best talents and most resourced engineering departments in the world. This was cars like, famously like the Jaguar E-Type, like the Ferrari Daytona, stuff that may have handled well. And in some cases, Daytonas are basically V12 trucks, right? Like some cases they traded a lot of things in order to be able to just eat up distance in big speed and comfort. And like the old image is, it's the beginning of the movie Italian Job, even though that's not a GT car, that's a Lamborghini. But the image is like ripping from Paris to Rome overnight, or crossing the Alps with some woman in a large hat, giant sunglasses in the right seat, and her hair is flowing and the sun's shining. And, the carburetors on your Lamborghini Espada maybe drool just a little too much fuel onto something very hot. And the whole thing goes boom, boom, flash, and there's smoke. And then you stand by the side of the roadside in the Apennines or the Fuda Pass or wherever, sucking on a gitanes. And I don't know, the whole thing is just kind of immolating in front of you. And the lady looks at you and she says, "Are we not getting to Rome this evening?" And you're like, "No, darling, I'm afraid we shall have to have the Maserati brought down from the stockist in France." And she sighs. And then you're like, "Well, at least I saved the basket of Stilton and Gruyere that was in the trunk. And we still have that bottle of Cote de Rhone. Why don't we sit here and watch the Espada burn, and you can take your top off and sun yourself in dignified fashion, because that is what us beautiful people do." And then, I don't know, boom, whack, a Maserati shows up and you get to Rome. That's kind of sort of like, that is what you do with GT cars. But by the 1990s, and that term has been used for so many things, right? It used to mean compromise. By the 1990s, it was just kind of a term that was applied to certain road cars, sort of, certain race cars, sort of. And really, we don't make those things anymore, right? Because the way the car industry works, because of how good we've got in making cars do more than one job really, really well, it means that if you want something to be small and light and handle well, it can also be really good at distance and vice versa, right?
Sam,
the 1990s.
Sam, can I just?
Yeah, I was looking at my notes like this is too much. Yeah.
I'm picturing a Ford Maverick or Pinto with the word with GT on the side of it.
Yes, right.
Like,
so this is a
at
term
some
that has
point,
been
everything was called
perverted.
a GT.
Right.
Yeah. It's been deeply, the point being, it's been deeply perverted over history. It almost doesn't mean anything anymore. And by the 90s, there was an FIA class that was called GT1. And for a hot minute, it was weird as hell. And this was a point where the cars in this class, it was somewhat kicked off by the success of the McLaren F1, which we've talked about on the show before. Basically, road-going supercar built as a road car, taken racing reluctantly. The guy who designed it wasn't really interested in it being a race car, won Le Mans through a moment of deep luck and rain, and also some deeply rad driving by a guy who was utterly bonkers in the rain. And that didn't set in motion what happened that we're about to talk about. But it was a big key event in it because there were other cars that kind of followed in that wake. These cars, like Jeff said, they were more like prototypes, but because the FIA's rules at the time, it was GT, the way the GT class worked, they had to be based on road-going cars. Except, there were, the way the rules worked at the time, those didn't really have to be road cars in the normal sense. They just had to be road cars in the sense that, like, I don't know, if I get a can of gray spray paint and a garden hose and some duct tape, and I spray Ross gray and I duct tape a garden hose to his nose and I go and send him to the zoo and I'm like, you're an elephant now, walk around making noises. And he does this. Like, there might be a couple people who were fooled, but really, Ross is not an elephant. Everyone would know it. After a while, they're just going to be like, dude, stop coming to the zoo. And this is a terrible analogy, by the way. And if you write emails telling me this is a terrible analogy, I will say yes. So, point is, I digress. In this moment, a whole bunch of cars came up in the wake of the McLaren F1. They were purpose-built prototypes in road car drag. At cars like the Porsche 911 GT1, which was essentially kind of an evolved version of the 962, wearing a hat of 911 and, like, I don't know, some clown makeup that gave a 911 face. And you had a Mercedes, and it's not the Mercedes we're going to talk about here, but it's the Mercedes that led to that car. This is not the car that flew that this episode is about, but it's very important in that story. And that car was called the CLK GTR. And the name is a tip into, it's a nod into all the ridiculousness tied to this, right? CLK was a road car badge. They'd used it for years. They only recently did away with it. It stood for the German words for coupe, light, and short. Short, incidentally, was Kurz, right? K-U-R-Z. And that was, if you ever heard of the Porsche 917K, that K stands for Kurz. It was a short version of the 917. Blah, blah, blah. Also won Le Mans. We'll talk about that later. So the road-going CLK at the time was this big, fat, comfy, like a traditional kind of GT two-door coupe sedan type thing, right? Great for distance, commuting, kind of a pig in the corners and the brakes, big, fat, heavy thing. Now, it had absolutely nothing in common with that CLK, but it was built and designed as a race car from the ground up, and it was sold as a road car in a small number. And I mean, when I say it was converted, I mean it was for road use, and they did this. I mean, it was lightly converted. They built them to meet what they call homologation minimums. The FIA's standards. Basically, if you want to race this car, you have to make so many for road use. That number was tiny. It was 25 production examples. So to make them road legal, slapping on turn signals, slapping on reflectors, slapping a coat of leather on the dash, and really not much else. Like, imagine taking a modern LMP2 car prototype and throwing in air conditioning and heat and like some rearview mirrors, and then you have this tiny thing with a boiling interior that you can't see out of and can barely get into, and it has massive overhangs for aero and a giant floor and under tray and wings, and is a pain even by supercar standards. And the racing engine that's used in the race car is basically just being forced to sit through traffic, right? And because of the way rich people work, rich people of the time looked at these cars, the Porsche 911 GT1, the CLK, and they thought, well, okay, that's deeply cool. I want that, even though it was deeply expensive and deeply stupid. There are a bunch of hand raisers for it. These are massive things. They sold, people tried to use them. Everybody discovered, well, okay, it's a terrible road car. And in the end, they just became kind of like a Limoges vase or some weird, like a Monet you hang on your wall, right? So the way Mercedes went about this process, because they did this like they did this like anybody else in the class. They wanted to go win endurance races. They wanted to win Le Mans. They didn't have a lot of seat time doing this kind of thing. The thing they'd won Le Mans with in 1989 was largely developed by Sauber. It had a lot of kind of period-specific and class-specific hardware in it. So what they did was they took they took a McLaren F1 and they looked at it and they kind of used it as a test mule and they swapped in some of their parts and blah, 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 blah. Then they started designing their own thing in the back of it. That's, oddly enough, that's not uncommon, right? And Porsche of the era was built by Porsche starting with a 962 and slapping on some other parts and aiming it at the FIA season and blah, 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 blah. But the Mercedes, that car was built for the 97 season. They made just under 30 of them in road trim. They were, again, horrendously expensive. They are developed by what is now the division of Mercedes called AMG, which is the company's tuning and performance arm. And AMG wasn't always part of the company. And at this point, it was not. But that division, it always had a really close relationship with Mercedes, dating back to the 1970s. Started as a hot rod shop, kind of a German tuning house. And so when they sat down to design this weird little silhouette thing that had like, a tiny little streetcar grill on it and headlights, but was really only a couple of feet tall and meant for 200 miles an hour at Le Mans and doing all this other rad stuff, they handed it over to AMG. R&D on that thing took about just under 4 months. And that process was aimed at the 97 season. They debuted it at Hockenheim. Its first race was at Hockenheim in April of 97. They unveiled it to the public. 6 days before that, something like 300 people, all those oligarchs we talked about, they raised a hand and they told their local Mercedes dealer or their pimp or their Coke guy or just happened to work up at a car maker in Stuttgart, I want one, give me one, blah, 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 blah. 300 people. Now, they don't get one, mind you. Like, they still only made fewer than 30 of these things. But all of those cars that ended up on the road were built just like the race cars. They were built by hand in a Falterbach, where AMG is based. And they were different from the race cars in tiny ways. They had little storage bins. Engine was larger, made more torque, but they were the same basic thing. The race car, though, that's what's interesting. This was a carbon and aluminum composite tub. It was built by Lola. What does Lola mean to you guys? Like, I can think of 1,000 things. I don't doubt you can think of 1,000 more.
Well, the first thing that's weird about that is they hired a British company to build their German car.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Not that Lola was bad. Lola was building great cars at that time and built mostly really good cars. Some not a few duds, but 99% really good cars. So they knew what they were doing. I always thought that was interesting that they didn't build their own chassis for it.
Right. And so Lola had been involved in everything, right? From Formula Fords on up to Indy and F1 over in various points in the years. And they built the tub for the thing. The engine was this mid-mounted production-derived V12, the version of the engine that was used in the S-Class and the SL production cars at the time. There was a 6-speed sequential behind it, an X-Track, and it had no driving aids, nothing, right? And no ABS, no traction control. Odd little piece of trivia. They threw ABS into the road cars, but also you look at it and you're like, well, first off, if you're in a situation where you need ABS in this and you're somewhere on a public road and this big long kind of shingle that looks like a mutant, I don't know, that like a CLK, a road going CLK, is basically what you give to your third wife's housekeeper in, I don't know, Miami Beach, and it gets 5 miles a year, and it's silver, and nobody cares. These are interesting road cars that no one cares about 5 minutes after they're built, even though, that doesn't mean they're uninteresting. It just means that big Mercedes coupes kind of get forgotten, right? So in that first season with the CLK, the mutant race car thing, they win a bit. They're decently successful. They get some of its luck, some of its skill, but they win a 4-hour enduro at the Nürburgring. They win 5 other rounds around the world. There's one in Japan, one in England. They win Sebring, they win Laguna Seca, and they end up locking the FIA Constructors and Drivers Championships. And what they don't do that year is enter Le Mans. Because again, this is a conservative company. And it's easy to forget that when you look at like the way their F1 team works now, the way the road cars work, where they're all like loud and obnoxious and they have crackle tunes. And like these are big, snorty things that just happen to have license plates on them. But even by the 1990s, the company still had legacies and layovers and mentalities, and sometimes board members who had been there or had just started in the wake of that 1955 accident. So that year, they had all that success, but they don't enter Le Mans. They don't take the thing to Le Mans because they're pretty sure it's not going to do well. The car is more suited to shorter races. It had that big V12 in the back of it. They're convinced that the V12, and they have the evidence to back it up, they're convinced the V12 won't last, but they decide, for the following year, we'll do it. And so they evolve the car. There's an evolution of it called the CLK LM. LM meaning, I don't know, lots of money, lovely monkey, Lotus Man, Ross, you're a Lotus Man, Lufa Master.
Oh yeah, I'm sure that's what it was.
Yeah, it totally meant that. Or, it meant Le Mans, right? It stood for Le Mans. And because of that, the LM was what happens when you look at a car and go more Le Mans now, which means aero was tweaked. The engine got smaller, turned into a V8. It was the engine related to the engine that engine was related to the motor they used to win that World Sports Car Championship in 89 and 90 and win Le Mans in 89, right? And all of this was in hopes that the car would be more nimble, be more stable at speed, be more durable, right? And so in 1998, the LM wins, the CLK LM, this evolution of the mutant thing, wins 6 races, 1-2. It wins the championship. But by the time they get to Le Mans, neither of the 2 cars they entered even finishes. It is such a faceplant that almost every book you can find describes it as nothing short of a failure, right? And Germans, cultural stereotypes are dangerous, but many of them are rooted in truth. And one of the stereotypes about German people is that they hate failing, and especially German engineers, that they hate failure. And whether or not that's true, you can imagine that after all that, after all the buildup, after all they had been through, I don't know, it probably just sucked. So they set their sights on changing things. And at this point, we have to talk about one more thing that happened that almost got overlooked. And it was kind of chalked up as a fluke. So that same year, in 1998, a driver named Yannick Dalmas is driving a 911 GT1, one of those, again, kind of sort of a 962, kind of not really wearing a hat at 911 on the front of it. He's driving at Road Atlanta at Petit Le Mans on the back straight, cars in traffic. The nose goes up a little over a rise. Air piles onto the floor. The car goes airborne. It flips. It is up. Like it is 4 wheels up. This is one of the spookiest crashes anyone has seen in years in professional motorsport, and especially at Road Atlanta, this place with big, long history of spooky crashes, right? Some people make a note of this. There's much discussion in motorsport circles as to why it happens. But looking back, you kind of think, well, see, maybe there wasn't enough discussion, right? Do you remember when that happened? I don't know. I was in high school.
I remember it because I was like 3 corners back coming through in a BMW and came around on the back straight and saw Dalmas's car stuffed into the wall. Yeah. I was in that race. So yeah, it was, it wasn't until after the race or after I got out of the car where I saw some replays of it and saw, whoa, that happened? I thought he'd just been clipped and pushed off into the wall or something, but I didn't realize he got airborne.
Did that, Jeff? I don't know. You're deeply curious. Like, You are a curious person. You're also deeply curious. But like, when that happened, you ask questions. It was like, oh yeah, somebody blew over.
Yeah, it was weird because we hadn't really seen that, and it was kind of prototypes were just kind of evolving in this crazy prototype from GT cars morphing into these prototypes, and people, the first reaction was, oh, the tracks can't keep up with the cars anymore, and they started changing tracks. But this, the car, it was one of those things where nobody did anything wrong, and all of a sudden, we have a problem here. And normally, that guy was an idiot, it caused a big crash and somebody got hurt. You're like, well, that's a thing. But this was different than that.
And Jeff, I think one time is not a trend.
Right.
It happens once and you go,
right.
Yeah, it happens, right?
Yeah.
So there wasn't enough yet to point at the problem.
Exactly. Yeah. They didn't know. They were like, and I think a lot of it was, that's a fluke.
Yeah.
And then it started happening. Well, let's talk about that.
So,
but I mean, it happened it wasn't solved overnight. I mean, they were still crashing, doing that same thing at Road Atlanta in 1992 with a Nissan. Chip Robinson flew one. That was a tire failure, but still.
So that's the interesting thing, right? So blowovers and cars going up. You mentioned before we started taping that this stuff dates all the way back. It dates back to the Can-Am. Like essentially, since we started learning just enough about aero to be dangerous and just enough about power and handling to get things going really, really fast in places that hadn't necessarily been designed for that kind of speed, right? So in '98, toward the end of that year, Mercedes had been so dominant, and this wasn't the only reason, but Mercedes had been so dominant that there's classing changes and some manufacturers pull out of GT1. Porsche and McLaren dropped out for 1999, and the FIA essentially kills the class. That said, the ACO, the Automobile Club de l'Ouest, the outfit that runs Le Mans, they stopped allowing GT1 cars at Le Mans because, of course, it's not an FIA class anymore. What they did do was they created a class for Le Mans called LMGTP. It's Le Mans Grand Touring Prototype. And it's very, very similar to GT1. And it's much in common with a class that already exists, LMP, Le Mans Prototype, right? So that change isn't critical, but it kind of served as a little bit of a reset. And it also, like the concept of resets in this whole story matters because every time there's a big change, every time there's a rule change, every time there's a massive technical change to your car, you can test and you can learn things and you can go back to the drawing board and you can learn things and you can break cars apart and you can learn things. But ultimately, you do not learn anywhere near as much as you learn actually running the car in traffic, at speed, in real conditions, not, on a track by yourself for 30 or 40 hours in the middle of nowhere at Paul Ricard. You only learn real lessons while you're running the car. So late in 1998, Mercedes basically buys a controlling stake in AMG. They buy it from the co-founder of the company and the guy who owned it, this rad dude named Hans Werner Aufrecht. Now, this dude, he had been attached to Mercedes, since before he founded AMG with his partner. But that choice, when they brought AMG in-house, Hans was still kind of kicking around. And in 1998, he had started a division of AMG called HWA after his initials. And that was kind of sort of divested when the company bought AMG, but it was kept separate. And they took over all the racing work and all the motorsport work. And their first job was making the 1999 version of that CLK, the mutant thing that had been turned into the LM for 98, that had seen a bunch of success and then not a success, and they never quite made it work at Le Mans. Their first job, HWA's first job, was making that car's successor happen. And that car was designed by the same guy who had done the cars that came before it. It was a dude named Gerhard Unger. They didn't have much time, right? So they started with what they had before. They started poking it and tweaking it. They had some known quantities, and That car that came out of that process was called the CLR, and it looks a lot like the CLK LM, except it doesn't. The great thing, one of the neat parts of the program, one of the ways it was so easy, reasons it was so easy to kick out, because they didn't have to think about road car needs, right? The rules were different. That whole thing where you had to build a minimum homologation spec for it, it's thrown out the window because the ACO, and they don't care about that. And this is the French at their most French, right? And sometimes that's terrible, sometimes that's great. And occasionally you get weird, neat little moments where they're like, what if we do these? But what if we also do not care about the other thing, right? So they get to focus entirely on this project. The bodywork is massively redesigned in the chase for aero and the chase to lower drag. There's a big fat emphasis on lower drag because this car is aimed at Le Mans. It is not aimed at much else, right? They're not really worried. Their plans to run some sprint races, but that's not the main goal. They do a bunch of wind tunnel testing at the University of Stuttgart's wind tunnel because they didn't have their own wind tunnel at that point, right? It is for the thing that ends up is that coming out of all this ends up being 4 inches shorter than the CLK before it. It is tiny. The wheelbase is shorter. The nose is lower and longer and flatter, and the overhangs are longer. To put this in perspective, when this car ended up running, it ran against similar cars from BMW and Audi and Toyota. It had the shortest wheelbase in the class. It had the longest overhangs in the class by inches and inches. It had a 105-inch wheelbase. BMW was like 109. The Audi was like 106. Toyota spat out a car that was like 112. Like short distance between the wheels, big, long bodywork hanging out over each end of the wheels. And this will become important later, right? And in the end, what they built, it kind of looked like a CLK GTR, like the LM. It looked like one of those cars that had fallen into like a vat of sex. It was just dripping with rad, liquid, slinky, smooth, it was a big flat thing with these honking big tire bumps and the bodywork and these little ear-shaped mirrors coming off of it. The windshield was just wide and square but small, and factory cars are silver, and that always looks good on slinky shit. And I probably shouldn't say shit on this show, but if you're a child listening, I'm sorry. Shit's a good word for this slinky shit. And on top of this, there are the same kind of weird little details that they slung on the CLK, where they're like, yes, it is related to the street car. It has these kind of production derived headlights and grill, like these jokingly applied things to the bodywork. There's CLK taillights in the back of it. Like, it's tiny and it looks ridiculous because it's got these streetcar parts on it, but it looks great. The press photos are just deeply comical, right? There are all these staged factory photos where the driver group that they had around it, 7 or 8 or 9 guys, are standing next to it, and they are huge next to it. And there's one picture, I love this. There's one picture where it's next to a CL, next to a road-going CL, which is what the CLK was renamed at that point, the road car. And the road car, the race car, the headlight tops of the race car are barely at the same height as the bottom of the road car's front bumper cover. The race car's windshield top hits lower than the top of the road car's hood, and the highest point on the race car is the highest point on the race car is the rooftop engine intake, which when you see the car on its own in pictures, you're like, oh God, it's a monster. Shove a watermelon down it. And then you see it in reality. You see it next to anything for scale. It's this little long snouty tube flattened out of proportion with the rest of the car. And in that picture where the CLR is parked next to the road car, to the road car that it ostensibly has some relationship to, that roof intake is lower than the base of the windshield wipers on the road car, and the intake is smaller than smaller than the left headlight on the road car. It's tiny. This is a dinky thing that just happens to be about 40 miles long. The monocoque, the tub, is the same stuff. It's still carbon and aluminum, honeycomb, it's composite. Has some bits shared with the CLK that came before it. The rules have allowed a drop in weight, so it's around 90 pounds lighter. Uses the same basic 90-degree V8, this cross-plane thing. It's like 5.7 liters, makes 600 horse, 7,000 RPM. There's an X-Track sequential behind it. Like, suspension is basically CLK LM stuff. Had a third spring in the back, although this is odd, Jeff. Most of the pictures I've found, the book said it has a third spring, but pictures didn't show up one way or the other. It'll be relevant later, right? Because we talked about this earlier, like the blowovers. Aero stability is important in all of this. So they're testing the thing, right? in February of 1999, the season's about to kick off. They go to Cal Speedway in America. Well, in some cases, the season has kicked off, I guess. They go to Cal Speedway in America, in Fontana, Southern California. They do 30 hours of testing. It's divided into 3 chunks because there's a ban on nighttime testing at the time. 9 hours, second one's 13 hours, third one's 8 hours. They do high-speed testing there. They go to the big fat oval at Homestead in Miami. Around a month later, they go to, and you guys are going to have to tell me how to pronounce this. I've never heard it pronounced the same way twice. Magnycours in France. Manicure?
Sure.
How do you say it?
Perfect.
You got it. You nailed
Sounds
it.
good.
Baguette.
Yes.
Baguette.
Go with that, Monsieur Sam Smith.
Point is, they do all this, right? They take it to Malclou. They take it to Paul Ricard. They do a bunch of tests. There's a 36-hour test at Paul Ricard. At Malclou, they do a 24-hour test just nonstop. And these days, that's pretty common with factory Le Mans efforts if the rules allow it. Then, much less so. They show the thing to the public in April. By that point, it had more than 22,000 miles of testing, and nothing really major has gone wrong. They popped a motor or 3, right? They're feeling good. The program is just monstrous. This is Mercedes at the tail end of the century of the automobile. Remember, this is the oldest extant manufacturer in the world. They all but invented the car in the late 19th century, and they have this long tail of history behind them. They want to win. The program is monstrous. There is massive funding, scads of infrastructure. They wanted it bad. They tell the press that a guy named Norbert Haug, I believe it's Haug, Haug. He's the motorsport manager for Mercedes-Benz at the time. Famously interesting dude. He tells the press there are no major problems. And the car ran like clockwork. So they dial all this stuff in. They plan to go to the test. The pre-qualifying and test sessions happened before Le Mans. The race is in June. Pre-qual and test was in May. And they're thinking, okay, well, we'll run some other races after Le Mans, partly to help justify the cost of the program, and partly to, it's a race car. You race a race car. So they planned 3 cars for the race. Car number 4, car number 5, and car number 6. That's interesting. Jeff, I think at one point, so one of the drivers is a French guy named Christophe Bouchou mean anything to you?
Yeah.
You worked with him at level 5, right?
I did. He was at level 5. He was there for a while.
I want to hear Jeff
Ross's
talk
face.
about Christophe.
Jeff's face and Ross's face. Both of them, it's like Ross really enjoys something that's not going to happen, but might happen. And Jeff is like, I'm not going to say a thing.
Yeah, Christophe was a French race car driver. He drove at level 5.
You don't have to share more. It's okay.
Yeah, well, I think we'll leave it there.
Okay, all right.
It's probably best we just
leave
it right there.
So they get a stack of drivers, right? Some of these names are recognizable. Some of them are not. Some of them are recognizable because you may have heard the names in relation to the accident. So Bouchou's one of them. A guy named Bernd Schneider, long-time Mercedes-Benz dude, DTM ace. He was in his mid-30s, but the dude is still fast. They get a kid named an Aussie kid with a deeply prominent chin that you could cut glass with, named Mark Webber, who would, we all know, go on to drive in F1 many seasons. He was then only 22. There was the aforementioned potentially topic of discussion, blah, 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 Bouchou, a guy named Peter Dumbreck, who's 25 from Scotland, and a dude, I didn't know this until recently, a dude named Nick Heidfeld, like F1 Heidfeld. I didn't know Heidfeld came out of that stuff. He was 22. So 3 cars, right? One of those cars gets an automatic entry to Le Mans because Mercedes-Benz won the 98 FIA GT title. The other 2 cars have to qualify. They have to qualify the race during those pre-quali events in May. And at this point, context helps. I remember watching this stuff in high school, and it seemed like everybody was gunning for Le Mans, right? They are going up against Audi in the beginnings of its epic money-burning, more than decade-long program that would, they basically come to be synonymous with Le Mans dominance, right? They're also going up against BMW, they're going up against Nissan and Toyota in the same class. And all of these efforts are massive, massive spends. And a lot of people think, okay, well, Mercedes is kind of the favorite. They've got a lot of momentum and they're going to do all right. Except they show up at the test day And they just absolutely don't have it. Now remember, this car isn't much different fundamentally from the thing they've run before. And they've run Le Mans in the modern era. And they have a stacked lineup of drivers. And those three cars end up 6th, 14th, and 15th after the first round of time sessions. They are slow. These are cars that are designed, remember, to win the race overall from an overdog manufacturer, and they are slow. The Germans are shamed. They go home. Germans, I'm assuming, I don't want to stereotype, but I'm assuming Germans panic, but I'm assuming they panic different from us with a lot of like scowling. So they go home. They take the cars to Hockenheim, which is famously fast track. The car gets configured. They configure it with lower downforce. They're looking for speed. They know it has downforce problems. They rig up 1,000 little tiny touches trying to pull speed out of the car. They come back to Le Mans in June, and they're kind of like, no, we don't. Things are not much better. They hustle and hustle and hustle, and the best they can do is fourth in quali with the DTM guy, Bernd Schneider, who, this is a fun name to say, Bernd Schneider. And he is out there just driving the balls off the car, and it is not enough. But, they're Mercedes. They got to run. And then, on the second day, it is Thursday evening. The race is Saturday. It's the number 4 car. Mark Webber is in it. It's 7:28 in the evening. He's chasing one of the Audis. It's driven by a guy named Frank Biela, who, again, fun name to say. And the Audis at that point were open cockpit things, big, long, silver, shingly things. These look rad as hell, right? They are between Mulsanne Corner and Indianapolis at around 180 miles an hour. I pulled this into meters per second because I was curious. 84 meters per second. 180 miles an hour is 84 meters per second. Webber is in the Audi's wake. He moves out of it. He's prepping to pass. And the car just the steering gets light for a heartbeat. And less than a heartbeat after that, the car goes front wheels up. It blows over. It becomes a leaf on the wind, right? It is in the air. So he later ended up telling Motorsport magazine, Webber, he said, it cartwheeled high into the air. It went very quiet. I saw the sky and then the track again. And all I could think about were the 3 women in my life, Anne, my mom, and my sister. I was paranoid about going into the trees. I knew how thin the windscreen was. And I thought, if anything comes in here, I am secondhand for sure. Eventually, I landed. So none of this is caught on camera. It wasn't in an area with any real spectator counts to speak of. But the car, it didn't just go up. It is tumbling backwards. It is somersaulting through the air. It gets terrifyingly high. It turns as it heads back down toward Earth, and it hits the pavement on its right side at a right angle to the track's direction of travel. Then, as if that weren't enough, it flips back onto its wheels, and it still has a bunch of kinetic energy, so it slides nearly 1,000 feet into the Armco at the side of the track. Now, Webber, the marshals pull him out, and he goes to the hospital. His neck is sore, his back is sore, his chest is sore, he has whiplash. all the press releases, like, I look at all that and I'm like, yeah, he is not fine. And I thought that, and then I pulled up a bunch of reports from the era, and all the press releases are like, Webber is fine. Of course he is. Just a few cuts, right? He literally tells the press it's nothing massive. Now, before they turned that car into so much yard sale, it was about 10th on the grid based on its fastest time. And it is just absolutely hammered. It looks like, I don't know, have you ever watched those? I don't know if you guys have watched those videos on YouTube of like somebody puts a bowling ball in a washing machine in a field and then turns it on. And then the thing just like, I don't know, it starts dancing around.
Destroys itself.
It just eats itself. This is what that car looks like. It is done, right? And the number 5 CLR is 7th. Toyota is on the pole by nearly 2 seconds over the fastest time in the Mercedes, and that ended up being, again, our boy Burned, because, I don't know, burned. But Burned, he went fast the day before, he's gridded 4th. And the race starts in 2 days. And Mercedes, when they get the car back, they look at it and they're like, well, okay, They decide to fix it. They announce in a press release that they're going to fix it, which means they kind of have to at that point, right? They take a spare tub from one of the test cars and they build the thing around that. And this is not a big deal. Even then, this wasn't a big deal 30 years prior, right? Race teams do this all the time. Like, how many? I mean, guys, I have been to a fraction of the number of pro race events that either one of you have, and I still have lost count of the number of times I've seen somebody go, okay, and then build a car up from a bag of bits, right? It's common.
Ross has experience with that at Le Mans recently.
Yeah. Twice.
When? What happened?
Actually, I mean, it is amazing what, a race car is Jeff, you can explain this better than I can, but a race car is just it's a
tool.
It's a tool, but it's a bunch of parts bolted together, right?
Yep.
And, if that part's no good, just put another one in. Yeah. So very modular, I guess. Yep. And it's kind of almost shocking when you see a car that's it is destroyed, like completely gone. And then, a few hours later, they're firing the engine up and got it on the setup pad again. So, race team crews that actually there should be a show just about that. The rebuilding race cars.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, just as a quick example, you had your driver do a tub, right, at Le Mans, and how long did it take them to? It happened on the Wednesday, and they were back Thursday, or I can't remember the details.
Yeah, I mean, they work and they didn't work all the way straight through the night. They worked late, probably till 2 a.m, went and got some 4-hour sleep, came back. But it is a brand new car. And the most amazing thing is that they built this brand new car and the driver hops in, it goes on the track, and it's perfect.
Right.
It's not like, now we got to take a week or a month to sort it out.
Right.
Yeah. It's just, it's the same car.
So they do that, right? They get the whole thing back together. And what's interesting at the time, and it's interesting in retrospect, and it must have been interesting a little at the time, and you have to wonder if anybody asked any questions. But again, that blowover was looked at as a fluke. So our boy Mark, whatever, it's just, how all my friends and I used to say it when we were watching, lightly drunk and watching F1 on TV. Mark becomes like a bird. He goes on Nelly Furtado and has to fly away. And nobody asks really deep questions because it's like, well, that sort of thing happens. Like there was a cause, problem. Couldn't have been our problem, right? It was maybe a fluke of the weather and wind and swamp gas reflecting off the right light from Venus. And I don't know, maybe Burned had too many beans the day before. Like nobody pulls these things apart in the moment beyond the amount that is deemed necessary, which is usually not a lot, because there's a lot going on. And I don't know. I mean, I've heard this, Ross, I'm curious. I've heard this described as there's a term for it. It's something like problem blindness in stressful situations where you get kind of zeroed in on the next step and the next step and the next step instead of seeing the whole. Like, is that common in drivers and teams? Is it just something that ends up being a byproduct?
Absolutely common. And I think what it is racers are racers, and all they care about is let's get back on track. And sure, there were probably some people in the back of the garage that weren't actually rebuilding a car, that were probably poking around and trying to figure out what happened. I have done that where a driver has crashed the car, and while the car is being fixed, you're trying to figure out, how do we stop this from happening again? But that's not the highest priority. No. It sounds like it should be, but the highest priority is get back on track and let's keep going. Keep on pushing through this.
And I've been on the the side where we're trying to figure it out, what the problem is. And the worst thing is somebody comes up with a theory and everybody goes, oh yeah, that's what it is. And then you just move on. And the theory hasn't been proven out. You haven't thought about what else it could be. It's like, oh, well, yeah, that was a fluke. This happened. And everybody agrees. And then you just wash your hands of it and go on.
And I think what happens, especially again with a trend of one, is you go, somebody made a mistake.
Right.
And okay, we won't make that mistake again. And I'm pretty sure there were people there going, Mark Webber made a mistake.
Yeah.
And I guess the mistake he made was getting back in the car.
But so think about this, right? So he later, at one point, he says something like, he gives an interview and he says something like, it felt like the car was up for like 5 or 6 minutes. Time slows down, yada, yada, yada. He goes back and he talks to the team, and this is actually in his autobiography, which is really interesting. And his autobiography in general is cool. If you have any time for it, or if you have any time, it's worth picking up. But the team initially doesn't believe him. Like, they said it wasn't possible that the car could have done what it did. And the telemetry backed it up. Like Biela, Frank, the guy in the Audi, the other driver, backed it up. But there is a press conference after the fact. Keep in mind, this is the first. Car blew over 3 times. We'll get to the other 2. The first one. There's a press conference after the fact where Norbert Hoig, the manager, the motorsport manager, and Weber both agree that the car didn't somersault. They just said the front came up and hit the ground again. I don't know. That Weber is I don't know about you guys, but Weber is my favorite part of this story. And not least because I met the guy once and found him just like extremely interesting and, dirt bike guy and 911 guy. And he has the, giant chin, which is like oddly compelling, weird way. Just, we want to follow it and ask it questions like, what do you do? But he is just interesting in ways that other drivers aren't, because he got back in the car. And drivers, I don't know, Ross, I love it every time you say something like drivers are crazy, right? He got back in the car because of course you do, right?
Especially when you're 22, you're trying to make an impression, you've got a job to do, and drivers aren't appreciated when they go, hey, everybody, I'm scared.
Why? I mean, you know why, but why? Why is that? It's human, and yet it's seen as a flaw.
Because this is supposed to be a macho sport. And I'm going to say that, like many sports, the whole, mental health piece of it has become more acceptable. But, especially, through the 1900s and the early 2000s, it was just, sorry to say this, but it was just, hey, man up, get back in a car, go. And I think, what is as interesting as Weber is you've got these other drivers, and the very first thought that goes through their mind is, Mark made a mistake. I won't be doing that. This won't happen to me. As time goes on, there's maybe a little bit more of, well, maybe this is more than just Mark making a mistake. And then there's, wow, this is scary, but you know what? It's my job. I got to get in there. I got to man up. I got to do it. And that's the attitude that most drivers have. Most drivers will have the attitude of, hey, this isn't going to happen to me because I'm better than that.
And I think there's the other aspect that I've seen is what they're scared of is losing their job, because there's 100 other guys who will get in that thing and do it. And I think they're more scared of that.
And I gotta, this is maybe a little bit of a tangent here, but I was thinking about this, and I have been in a situation, I'm not proud of this, but I have been in a situation where a friend at Indianapolis was killed, Jovi Marcello. Oh. And, you feel bad for a moment. And then you think, I wonder if I can get his ride. And it's like I said, I'm not proud of that. But at that moment in your career as a race driver, that's what you're thinking. And you're thinking, if I don't get in a car, I don't have a job. There are other drivers who I'm pretty sure were saying, hey, put me in.
No.
So it's brutal, and it is selfish, and it's ugly.
So there's this whole separation. You mentioned the macho thing earlier, right? And I find this fascinating, but there's the root of not wanting to admit you're scared, right? Is the notion that on some level, when we are afraid, we don't perform as well because we're not willing to take chances. But the definition of bravery is not being scared and then doing a thing. It's doing a thing in spite of being afraid, right? And then performing in spite of that. And to me, I don't care if somebody says they're scared. If you say you're scared and you go out and rip off a lap, several tenths faster on the absolute edge than anybody else, like that's impressive. And the fact that you're honest about it. And there are a handful of quotes from other drivers, especially Dumbrick, one of the guys who went up in the later CLR flips, talking about how like they got into the car kind of a little spooked and had to talk themselves into not thinking about it. Do you mind if we talk about Webber for a second? I find him really interesting. So he's the dude isn't everybody's cup of tea, but he had a hell of a career, right? Dude, he would go on to have 12 seasons in F1, 9 wins. I had to dig up the numbers because I was curious. 9 wins, 42 podiums, 13 poles, right? Like even by the standards of long-termers in F1, that's decent. Like after he left Mercedes, he left sports cars entirely. He drove for like 4 different F1 teams. He was the son of a motorcycle dealer. Like grew up in a town in New South Wales in Australia. I won't even try to pronounce. Used to go and watch sprint cars and bike racing as a kid. Had F1 drivers and bike racers on his wall. Like it's a deeply competitive dude who tried everything he touched competition wise. Loved it, like swimming, cricket, tennis. His dad got him into karting to distract him from. He was apparently a pretty wild kid, and it was all just to like, I don't know, keep him off the streets or keep him from huffing paint thinner or whatever the hell he was doing. But he's this determined guy. And all of this is relevant because of what happens next. Because again, car went up and he got back into it. Okay. But when he was in the early parts of his career, didn't have a lot of funding, right? It's this scrappy background in a lot of ways. He got hired by Norbert Hoig, by the team manager at Mercedes, after Autosport, the magazine, ran a story about how decently he had done in Formula 3 in 1997 and how he had just scraped together money and won this championship round of the Formula 3 season at Brands Hatch, and then ran out of money and had to go home to Australia, and Autosport runs the story, and Hoig sees the story. And at one point, like Webber is stone cold out of money and at his absolute lowest. He's at that point where he thinks his career is over. And Hoig offers him a seat in the Nürburgring round of the FIA GT Championship in the CLK, the big, long, fat thing that came before the CLR. And one of their drivers couldn't make it. They offer him the seat. And this is what gets me. Webber says no. He's coming up out of Formula Ford and Formula 3 and all the ladder series. And he says no. And he owns up to this several places because, and this is why it's worth checking out the dude's autobiography, because he is stone cold honest and a deep straight shooter. But what he said was he knew the CLK was out of his depth. He hadn't tested it. He said, I had been in Formula Fords and nothing faster just 8 months before that. And so Hoig is like, all right, sure, okay. And they throw him a test in the car. Later, goes really well. He doesn't run the race. They offer him a ride in the thing for 1998, pay for the rest of his season in Formula 3. Dude's 21 years old at this point. He has a 750 horse V12 under his right foot. It's a weapon, And he talks about, Ross, I thought of you when I read this. He talks about being really arrogant until he met Bernd Schneider, that DTM driver, who was then the reigning FIA GT champion and just like this massive name in not just Mercedes motorsport, like motorsport in general. He said that in F3, I'd been pretty arrogant, just wanted to get on a race, wasn't looking at the telemetry, wasn't learning from it. This is the killer. He says, we didn't have any of that, meaning telemetry, in Australia. And I thought that relying on it was a weakness. If somebody else was doing a corner better than me, I felt I had to work it out for myself. And he said, Byrne taught him to look at the big picture, right, and give feedback. But this was not a dude without macho balls, right? And have you ever met anybody who just didn't want to look at the data? Who thought it was all in the testicles? How the hell does that work?
Yes. Yes. And I've coached drivers like that. And I'm going to say it's far less now. I mean, it's part of the job now is to look at that stuff. But I think, you touch on the arrogance piece, and I'm going to say drivers go through this. They tell themselves that they're the best and they don't need anybody else. And they tell themselves that enough times. It's the standing in front of a mirror Saturday Night Live skit where, I'm a good person or whatever it is. And you tell that you're constantly having that conversation with yourself. And, the arrogance is you keep doing it enough to the point where you believe it. And hey, some drivers back it up enough times where they do believe it. But even the very best, I mean, Lewis Hamilton admitted earlier this year that he questioned himself. So I don't care who you are. Max Verstappen, people go, oh, the guy's arrogant. Well, you know what? He questions himself. I'll guarantee it. So we all go through that. But as part of the job, you have to keep telling yourself, just go for it. Like push. And, you mentioned stereotypes earlier on, and Australians are kind of push on regardless kind of guys, right?
Right.
So there's a bit of that, right? I was always super impressed with Webber. I always kind of got the feeling when he was in Formula One that, skill wise, technique wise,
Right.
he wasn't Sebastian Vettel, but he just made it happen. You will something to happen enough, and things happen. And I think Webber did a lot of that.
So before we go any further, we need to do a slight digression into where all this happened. So that first crash was between Mulsanne and the Indianapolis complex, and Mulsanne the corner, right? Because the Mulsanne Straight is long. It is the length of the Le Mans circuit, essentially. It's just over 3.5 miles, and it's been a part of that track since the very first time they ran a 24-hour race there, which was early 20s, right? They chopped it into 3 sections in the 1990s with a pair of chicanes, but it was seeing speeds of more than 200 miles an hour during the race as early as the 1960s. Derek Bell, at one point, he won Le Mans overall 5 times, famously with Porsche, drove them in the 1980s, 1990s, 1970s. He used to talk about how, like, in the days before wind tunnels, you never knew if the car was going to stay on the road. And it is so easy, I think, to forget that what we're talking about here, like, this is not an oval where everyone is cruising around at 200. Not that there's anything wrong with that. This is a 2-lane, temporarily closed French highway, a trunk road, basically, where people are doing essentially aircraft speed in terms of how the wind works. 200 miles an hour it's like 60 miles an hour faster than the cruise speed of a Cessna 172. It is non-trivially faster than the takeoff speed of a modern airliner, right? Now, there are all these stories. Prepping for this, I went back and just read a bunch about Le Mans, because of course you do, because I'm a dork. There are all these stories from people like Andy Wallace and Derek and Brian Redmond talking about the first time they met the Mulsanne. They were scared of it. And you don't admit that, and going back to what Ross said, but just the notion that this is a big, fast part of a big, fast circuit. And in the end, Webber got back into the car, right? Next day, of course you do. So there's what they do is the number 4 car that crashed, they took a tub and they rebuilt it again, right? It's by Saturday morning. Webber tells the team he's okay to race. He's checked out medically. He's okay to race. There's a 30-minute warm-up, and Webber gets back into the number 4 car, although it's not the number 4 car. It's a collection of bits. It's like, George Washington's axe. It's the USS Constitution, or Nelson's flagship. It's the Mercedes sexy slink of Theseus. It is a race car that occupies the same space that the number 4 used to occupy, but it gets in it. And this warm-up, they go out in a brand new car. It is untested. They have no idea what it will do, but of course it's the same thing. It's the same pile of parts, same specs, same limit. Like, it's the known quantity, right? But they go out there, bang, boom, boom. It's the outlap. It is an install in live traffic at Le Mans. It was hours before the race. All 3 of the team cars are piling down the Mulsanne. They are behind an Oreca Dodge Viper, which, if you do not know RAD, Google the words Oreca Dodge Viper, ORECA, and then just, 3 hours later, look out the window and ask yourself why we no longer have things like the Oreca Dodge Viper. But they're behind a Viper. Webber's in the number 4. He is last in line of the 3 cars, and they are going over the rise in the track just before Mulsanne Corner. On the Mulsanne Straight, the last corner, the corner at the end of the Mulsanne Straight is called Mulsanne Corner. It's a cute right? I mean, what is it? What gears in it, Bing, guys?
It's very cute. Yes, it's essentially a hairpin.
Jesus, the dad jokes.
Yeah.
So it's tight, right? Like
Yes.
what
It's a
what
first
speed
or
is it?
second gear corner.
Okay, so what speed is it in a P2 car, modern?
60.
60-ish, yeah.
Oh, God, it's slow.
At the apex. It's the first right of a roundabout, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's like that really, everybody's done roundabouts. It's the one that's tighter than a 90.
But it's tighter. Yeah.
Actually, wait, that makes sense. Yeah, because highway, because roundabout, because of course it is. So they're piling into this. Like, again, it's an install lap. It's the out lap. It's like 9:35, 9:36 in the morning. Weber isn't even fully on it, warming up the car. They're doing maybe 170 miles an hour. There is a rise in the track that has since gone, and we'll get to why it's gone. But there is a rise in the track, a slight lift, and they go over that. And Weber goes Nelly Furtado again. The thing flies again. It lifts off again. It goes 30 feet in the air. There are more backward somersaults. It twists, it moves, it falls. The right rear of the car hits the track first. It starts shedding parts. The rear wing and the nose and the engine cover just yard sail into the breeze. They are gone. And the thing slides on its roof and comes to a stop close to Malzahn Corner and presumably in that roundabout, which is kind of rad to think about. And Weber, again, is not really hurt. There's a quote in his autobiography where he says something like, "What the bleep were those guys doing giving me a car like this? And then there's no way I can be that jammy again." Basically, he's saying, there's no way I can do that again. I'm not going to survive this twice. And he says, he thought to himself, I don't want any pain. I just hope it's over quick. Which, like, if you can think about what happens in an accident and how time slows down, but also it doesn't, is bonkers to comprehend. But anyway.
Hey, Jeff.
Jeff,
can I ask this is an engineering question. Maybe you need to start a spreadsheet on this, but I mentioned earlier that 1 is not a trend.
Right.
Is 2 a trend?
I think so, right? Because the only reason I say that is because we draw things called trend lines, and you have to draw a trend line, you need 2 points. So 2 data points must be a trend. A not very well established trend, but certainly a trend. I'll go with that. We'll say it's a trend. It certainly makes you, I'm sure the engineers were like, oh, now we have a real problem. They all went. The first one was like, oh, well, that happens. The second one was like, no, that doesn't just happen twice.
Well, engineers, team, maybe even other drivers are going, man, this Mark Webber is a real idiot. He's done it twice.
Right.
Because, I mean, the other part of this trend is it's the same driver.
Right. But some of those guys are like, I'm sure some of those drivers had to be like, okay, if there was like a $10 million prize for being able to flip one of these things, how would I make this thing? How would I do that with my steering wheel and my controls that they've given me? Like, what could I possibly do to cause this? And probably didn't come up with a good answer.
And wouldn't have been cool to have been there and find out, like, is Weber going over to the other drivers and saying, hey guys, this is what seems like is happening here. Don't do this.
Right.
So they had footage of this, right? Like, it was caught on camera. And if you have a minute, go on YouTube and find it and watch it again. And then, I mean, you'll probably end up doing what I did, which is you watch it like 4 times because it looks deep fakey. Yeah, it looks like, oh, there's a car in a place where a car doesn't belong, and a car doesn't belong 30 feet in the air, right?
Sam, when I looked at this the very first time, I went, oh, this looks like a sim racing deal now.
Right,
like,
right.
You see this in sim racing all the time.
Right.
Yep. Or like on iRacing, like a Miata ends up atop the tower at Lime Rock, and you're like, oh yeah, cool. That guy just really dorked it. Like, stuff that happens that can't happen in real life. So Weber gets out. He is just like white as a ghost. You can see him on some of the broadcasts. He is actually just like, dude has a met the face of Jesus look on his face. And at that point, Mercedes, this sounds deeply sane. And also, what? They decide, okay, maybe we shouldn't run the number 4 car in the race. And I mean, so that happens. And I don't know, man. what I love about this is that he said something later about basically saying that since Thursday night, since the first blowover, since the night after the first blowover, he'd been in denial. He'd kind of been telling himself that because there weren't any photos or footage. Like, this is the funny thing about confidence, right? He had convinced himself that this thing he experienced had not happened. He told himself it couldn't have happened, that the car wasn't as high as the treetops, right? And it just, how weird is that? It's rad. But now he's obviously convinced, right? Because it happened again. It's on tape.
Well, and that goes back to what I was saying about drivers will talk to themselves and do what it takes to convince themselves all is good. I'm still the best in the world. Put me in the car. Let me go and drive.
Yeah. So,
And I guess they had no in-car cameras just for like, obviously there wasn't any broadcast in-car cameras, but not for personal team use, driver use, engineering use. They had no,
right.
whatever the back in the day, GoPros. I guess now I'm thinking back 90.
It was long
I probably
predated
didn't.
GoPro, but
I didn't do
cameras are
that
still big.
either, I guess. So yeah, they just wasn't a thing back then. I wasn't running them back then either.
So I want to pause here in a second, and we need to unpack why the tech angle behind this. But before we do that, just think about where we are. Okay, so they've now flipped 2 cars. The number 4 car that they rebuilt overnight from a fresh tub, is now a giant pile of garbage. And Weber, he tells the press years later, he says, even if there was a car left for me, I wouldn't have gotten in. I was done. Like, before Thursday night, he says, I had trusted that car more than I trusted my own mother. And at that point, and this shows what kind of a guy he is, he said he wasn't worried for himself. He was worried for teammates, spectators, marshals, like literally anybody else caught up in that. Because keep in mind, both of these flips really just only impacted the car. Like, the car and the human in it didn't really leave the kind of the bounds of the track. It was just the car, but there was so much that could have happened that didn't. So Jeff, you and I talked a bit before we taped this, and you explained why and how this works. But there are 2 things that impacted this. One of them is pitch sensitivity, and the other is downforce loss in traffic. So can you start pulling the threads of why these things went up? Because it's a simple answer. It's not a simple answer, right?
Yeah, and I think if I was an expert, it's easy now, right? Because we know what happened.
Yeah.
And we know how prototypes have evolved to try to prevent this from happening and everything. So what I'm about to say isn't that these guys were stupid and they missed it. I mean, I know this because of what they learned and how they went through all of this. But what the basics of it are, if you think of an airplane, and when an airplane's flying level, it has a center of pressure from the nose to the tail of an airplane. There's a point where if you took all the aerodynamic forces on that airplane and you resolved them into one point, kind of like people know about a center of gravity, which is where all the weight would be centered on. Well, this is where all the aerodynamic pressures would be centered on. And when a plane's flying straight and level, the center of pressure of that aerodynamic forces is balanced. So it's not going up and it's not going down. If you want to change the attitude of your plane, make it go up, you move the center of pressure backwards by putting more lift on the front or more downforce on the rear by changing the wing angles. And it climbs or it descends based on where you move that center of pressure. So the center of pressure isn't a thing, but it's all the aerodynamic forces is the point where all the aerodynamic forces are acting on the car. And its relationship to the center of gravity determine whether the car or plane is going level, up or down. Basically what happened is, by definition, when that car took off, the center of pressure of that Mercedes moved too far rearward. And if you think of a big giant arrow pushing down on the front of the car to represent the front downforce and the rear of the car to represent the rear downforce, the big arrow on the rear was way bigger than the arrow on the front, and it was pushing down too much on the rear and levering the nose up. Just as if you put 20 big individuals on the back of that car and they all stood on the rear wing, the front wheels would come off the ground. That's what happened. The 20 individuals were the aerodynamic forces building up on that car, pushing down on the rear. The minute that got a little bit too much and the front started to pick up, the thing that I think we all realize now is a lot of people think, well, the air packed up underneath the front of the car then because the front lifted up and it just blew it over. And that was part of it. But the other thing is the shape of that car and those prototypes in those days was a wing shape. And what happened is the air, when the nose started to pick up, the air flowing over the front of the car now made that shape of that car relative to the ground look just like an airplane wing, and not an inverted airplane wing, a normal airplane wing. So the air flowing over the nose actually created lift and pulled the front of the car up, which moved the center of pressure even further backward and just flipped the thing over. So it's that center of pressure which is critical. Nowadays, we measure the center of pressure based on the loading of the wheels in real time. And we watch that very closely because it changes the balance of the car and the feel of the car. We're not so worried about blowing over anymore, but that's what happened to those guys. They got the center of pressure too far backwards. That car had some characteristics about it that is easy to see now why that happened. Nowadays, it wouldn't happen as easily.
I mean, one of the things you mentioned earlier, and that really helped me kind of understand how and why it happened, was, you think about the long overhangs, that massive distance that the other cars did not have between short wheelbase, which helps the whole problem or worsens it, and then that long distance between each wheel and the end of the car, and then the fact that as it went nose up, the diffuser in the back got closer to the ground, got more effective. The wing and the diffuser just did compounding work. The whole car goes up. So what is it about race car, when you're engineering a race car and setting the thing up, how can you end up with something? Because again, they were probably making a couple thousand pounds of downforce. They weren't heavy on downforce, even by period standards. But what is it about the design of a car like that can lead to such, because we're talking, we're talking small changes in pitch. You had mentioned that the front splitter on a car like this in that period losing massive effectiveness with like millimeter changes in ride height. What is it about that whole system that can end up so sensitive that a little bit of nose up makes it all fall apart?
And that's the early big splitters in those sports cars were pretty flat. And yeah, Ross, what I think you've dealt with some of those.
yeah. I've driven some of those. Yeah. In fact, a car that you and I had some experience with that.
Yep.
Yeah. So go ahead, and then I've got a question for you, Jeff.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the splitters by today's standards really sucked back then. And I don't mean the Mercedes splitter in general, the splitter technology, how we understood splitters. And the splitter is really that front floor. Let's call it everything from the center line of the front tires forward, under the car. That was just a flat sheet, basically, back then. And what happened is, because it was a flat sheet, it became very ride height sensitive. So if you moved the front of the car up a little bit, it lost a lot of downforce. If you moved it down, it gained a lot of downforce. And if you got it really close to the ground, it gained a lot of downforce. We talked back in our Ferrari 333 episode about how the front third spring helped control that, because the Ferrari splitter of, that early 90s era wasn't very good either. And so they were very sensitive to ride height and rake angle, which is the relative ride height of the rear of the car to the front of the car. If you have a lot of rake where the rear's high and the front's low, the center of pressure moves forward. But if you take a flat bottom car like that and do it the other way, where you raise the front up a little bit and lower the rear, the center of pressure moves rearward. And as you said, Sam, then the rear of the car, the underwing there, because it's getting closer to the ground, is making more downforce. So it's pulling it down even harder. The front of the car is going up and it's making less downforce. So the center of pressure goes even more rearward. And then you have this big lever on that Mercedes where from the rear wheel to where the wing was a long distance. So just like a torque wrench or any other big wrench, you get the leverage effect. So it didn't take a massive change in center of pressure to just tip the thing over. I guess a really good example, and we touched on it early in the episode, was a dragster. You've probably all seen a dragster blow over. Well, think about the amount of force that rear wing makes and the tire, and it just levers it over. I mean, you could almost pull it over if you could reach up there.
So can I ask a question, Jeff? If you had been there, if Norbert and all the Mercedes people and Mark Webber called you up and said, Jeff, come on over here. I think actually maybe you were at Le Mans, weren't you, that year?
That year, no.
Oh, okay.
No, I went a couple years later.
Well, pretend you were, and they said,
right.
Jeff, we got this problem. What would you have, knowing what you know now, not knowing what you knew then, but knowing what you know now, was there anything, short of redesigning the entire car, was there a relatively simple thing that could have been done to help that?
Knowing what I know now, because if I was there at the first, in the real time, knowing what they knew at the time, they're way smarter than me. I'm sure they were, the HWA guys know what's going on. I would have been of no help. But right now, if you're sitting there and that happened, you have to keep the center of pressure forward. That's the more forward. So how do you do that? You could put big giant dive planes on it. They put some little ones on, make them bigger. You could angle the front splitter down a little bit if you could put some rake in it. Again, that's kind of a redesign thing. If you were just going to tune it, I know they did. I read some things about they tried some damper things, like put a bunch of rebound in the front of it to try to hold the front of the nose down so it couldn't extend and come up. That aerodynamic force would just overpower that. You could run really big, stiff rear springs, or if it did really have a third spring, stiffen that up so that the rear of the car can't be pushed down by that big downforce. You could take away rear downforce, just run less wing, run less kick up in that little fin they had in the back under the wing. You could, that's really about all you could do. You could cut some holes in the front fenders.
That's what I was because one of the things that I think not too long after that, prototype cars all started having these vents on the top of the front fenders. And I don't know how much of a difference that would have made, but it just seemed to me like part of it was you're getting all this air building up under the front of the car as well.
The minute you start, the minute you started getting that rake into it, where the rear went down and the front just came up a little bit, then the air starts building up underneath it. And again, that was some of it, but I think a lot of people underestimate the actual shape. If you look at that car, there's some pictures of the car kind of almost in side view. And if you look at that with the front up in the air a foot, the shape of that car from the leading edge over up to the roof of that car, that's an airplane wing. That's what you're looking at out your window when you see it. That is an airplane wing. That is creating lift. And I know it's not suction, but it is actually sucking the top of that car up because of the airflow. The air is flowing faster over the top of the car than it's flowing under the car. And that's creating lift, just like an airplane wing does. The shape, man, that front of the car is shaped like an airplane wing.
So
And
that's what's crazy too. You look at it, and in plan form and from above and in front, that it was tiny and it was slick, and it didn't like they concentrated so much on drag and so much on top speed because obviously Le Mans, right? But so much of the car was built around, even early on. Remember we talked about earlier how they had downforce issues with it. They, there was a small aero kit for it that had dive planes on it that they ended up slapping on after the second flip, but so much of what the thing was able to do wasn't even, in aero terms, it wasn't even huge by the standards of the period. And that brings me to the next question, Jeff. So one of the other things that people talk about with this is the loss of front downforce from that car in traffic, that car in particular. And that was common for the period. But one of the blowovers, the one we'll get to in a second, did not have, there are a couple extenuating factors, but it did not have, the cars weren't following anything else. The car that flipped wasn't following anything else closely. So what is it about the way those cars were designed in period? These cars and GT1 cars and prototypes, period, in particular, that made them so sensitive to losing front downforce in traffic, but also how much of a factor did that play in this?
A big factor. I mean, it's still nothing's really changed from the physics part of it. You can go watch most GT3 races, and the reason it's so hard to pass is for exactly what was happening there with that Mercedes. You get behind a car and you lose front downforce because that air is disturbed and the clean air isn't hitting the splitter and the dive planes and all the things on the front of those cars that are designed to make downforce. So what happens? I'm talking about a modern GT car following another GT car. You follow that, the center of pressure moves backwards because you have less pressure at the front and the wing's still working relatively good at the rear, and you lose front downforce and it understeers because you don't have as much grip. So you can't pass. Okay, that's just part of racing nowadays. But if you're in a car like the Mercedes that is on the verge of lifting the front end because the center of pressure starts out by design rearward, and then you come up to a car that disrupts the air and the front downforce is reduced, now your center of pressure goes too far back and it tips it over, and now the front starts to lift, and now you get the airplane effect, the airplane wing effect, plus the air packing up underneath the splitter and in the fender wells, and it just flips over.
So I'm having this vision right now of, I'm imagining.
Where are you going? You're smiling. Where are you going?
I know.
With this?
I'm imagining a what if scenario. If 3 months before Le Mans, Mercedes has got this car in the wind tunnel, a rolling road wind tunnel, and they've got the car there and they're flowing the air over it, and they go, let's just raise the front of the car and see what happens. And they raise it a little bit, and they raise it a little bit, and all of a sudden the thing flips over inside the wind tunnel. Wouldn't that have been weird?
That would have been weird. Well, I can
also
say
would have saved.
Would have saved. I can say this problem is not easily solved, and engineers still deal with this problem. So Colin did a speed record run with a Daytona prototype at Daytona to break the fastest lap ever run around Daytona and to break some world closed course speed records, which they did. But at one time when they were doing the development, he took this Daytona prototype down the back straightaway, and they had trimmed it out and took all the downforce away from it. He went down the back straightaway early on, flat out going 240 miles an hour about. And the engineers, there were some FIA officials in the scoring tower wondering why he was weaving down the back straightaway at Daytona, like up against the wall, down around the grass, up against the wall, down around the grass. And he stopped in the pits, and the race engineer was looking at the data, and they found that the load on the front tires was, the amount of weight. Normally when it sits there on the ground, each tire weighed about 300 pounds, had about 300 pounds of force from the weight of the car, like on the scales. And they found that going down the back straightaway, the load on the tires was approaching zero.
Really?
And so what was happening is the nose was starting to lift up, just like what happened in the Mercedes. It was getting lighter and lighter and lighter and lighter. The center of pressure was moving backwards.
Oh, yeah.
And it was on the verge of lifting the front of the car off the ground. And the reason Colin was weaving side to side was because he had no steering left anymore. The front was just kind of floating.
I was going to say, what did he say it felt like?
Scary as
terrifying, I think.
All heck.
So this was.
He said that's the scariest thing he's ever done is try to break that speed record. It's just, there's other stories about that. We can talk about that later. But that was happening. This was, I don't remember, 2000 and.
It's like 13 or 12 or something, right?
Something like that. Yeah. I mean, so they were dealing with exactly what the HWA and Mercedes engineers were dealing with back in this era. Exactly the same thing. It's not easily solvable. So they weren't idiots. They were like, oh, that was obvious. They should have fixed it. That was hard and still is hard.
So the year that I won the LMP2 class at Daytona in the Rolex race, I was driving that Lola. And at the end of, so that was in 2003, the end of 2002, that was Grand Am at the time. Mm-hmm. Grand Am mandated a spec rear wing for all the cars. And the first time we tested with the car, it was like you were talking about, only it was the rear of the car.
Mm.
Like it was essentially, it was kind of almost like there was no rear wing, but it was especially bad if there were other cars around you.
Uh-huh.
And I mean, one of our drivers spun on the back straight at Daytona. Like, because it just started.
Spun on the back straight.
Got wobbly and started doing one of those
wagging
tank
his
slappers.
Tail and got into a tank slapper. And, but it was the same kind of thing. Like it was, we did this, we're getting out there, we're trying to tune through it, all that kind of stuff. And at one point we got a message from Lola, from some aerodynamicist at Lola saying, do not drive the car.
Stop. Yeah. Stop.
So, it is dangerous.
So that's
no kidding.
And guess what we did? Kept
driving.
We kept driving.
Of course.
We're gonna push through this, and we're gonna find a way, and we did.
Right.
Okay. So this is the jumping off point for getting back into the story, because remember we have one more flip to talk about. Side rail. If none of that made any sense to you, and we're talking about some mystery guy named Colin. If you don't know, Colin is Jeff's son. Google Colin Brown and Daytona prototype record 20. Again, I want to say it was 2013. It's really cool. He did, what was it, like 220 something miles an hour, Jeff? Something like that?
Yeah, I can't remember. It was, it was fast. It was the fastest around Daytona. The other cool thing was they broke the FI and still hold. They broke, actually, course? I think, closed course, standing start, 10 mile or 5 mile and 5K and 10 mile and 10K, I think. Closed course, standing start, and rolling, I think. Can't remember all exactly. And I think all those happen to be, as weird as it, now that we're talking about this, those were Mercedes records that were set on some giant 5 mile thing back in the 50s or 60s or something that he broke.
It seems to me it was like 226 or 228 miles an hour or something like that.
Something like that, which doesn't sound fast for like an IndyCar thing. I mean, but
at Daytona, yes,
it was fast.
I just looked. It was 2013. It was 222.9 in a Riley Ford Michael Schenck Racing.
Yep.
They did the car together. It was 10 miles at 210 miles an hour and 10 kilometers at 202 from standing start. That's super cool.
Yeah, so those are, I still think, current FIA world records.
So on that note, getting back to the whole you just run the car thing, remember we have one more flip. So this is where it gets real spicy. It's not over. Mercedes-Benz, so Weber has flipped twice. Weber is out. Weber is just, the number 4 car is a bag of bits. Weber goes, okay, even if they have a car for me, still done. But they have 2 cars left. And after all of that, Norbert, our boy Norbert, and the team, they get together and they feel that they have to run the cars in front of the public. They feel like this is important, both for the company, for the effort they've made this year, for the sacrifice of the people who risk their lives, so on, right? And you can argue either way, I think. An intelligent person could argue either way, both to stop the cars or to run them. But regardless, the engineers attack the problem. They are trying to figure it out. They stiffen the rear. They add those dive planes that they had in the bag to the front fenders. maybe help keep the car on the ground at the expense of drag and top speed, right? Most sources estimate that one change, those dive planes up front, adds around 25% more front downforce, chops maybe 5-7 kmh off top speed. So at Le Mans, which you don't want, they ask the drivers on the team if they feel good, if they think cars are too dangerous. And, naturally, like we've been talking, the drivers are all like, no, race car, drive race car. So they tell all the guys to not follow other cars too closely, right? Because they're aware of what's going on. Norbert reportedly calls, I love this, calls that they draft in people from the McLaren Mercedes Formula One team. Norbert Huyg reportedly consults with Adrian Newey, who is Adrian Newey, at that point just an aerodynamicist, but still Adrian Newey, on how to keep the cars on the ground. And Newey doesn't admit this at the time. He told the press, he's like, no one's asked me anything. And everybody was like, a couple years later, we found out that he did actually talk. Well, why did he initially deny it? Well, he denied it. You do the math. Don't know why he denied it, but supposedly what he told the team was stop the cars, withdraw, pull out of the race, just don't run them. Naturally, they ran them. So the two cars that are left, they start in 4th and 7th. They run okay, as high as 2nd at one point. And naturally, the guy in 2nd is our boy Schneider, Burned. I need to come up with I need a nickname for him, like nothing rhymes with burned. So they battle.
Something to do with brave, though. Brave.
Burn the brave. Yeah, sure. Schneider, I barely know her. So they battle over the first few hours between a pair of BMWs, pair of Toyotas. Like there's this nice long thing going on. And then around 8:45, 8:45 at night, like 76 laps in, Peter Dumbreck, which I mentioned him earlier. He was kind of a relatively unknown guy at the time and a pretty decent resume. He's Scottish. He's a really nice brogue if you find him on YouTube. He's fun to listen to. He's in the number 5 car, and he is running behind one of the Toyotas. He's close, but he's not crazy close. The footage shows him several car lengths back. Some accounts, say that he's nose to tail, which you go and you watch the tape. He's not nose to tail. But they are doing close to 200 miles an hour, heading into the setting sun. They are on the Mulsanne. They're at the kink in the straight. And at the kink, Dumbreck clips the apex curving, this tiny little piece of apex curving that was there. And the car just lifts off. Again, same thing. Just goes up, blows over, up, and it's 50 feet in the air. This is the biggest one yet. It's the fastest one. It is higher than any of the other cars. It's somersaulting. It's still somersaulting. It keeps going. It flies over a marshal's position, over the Armco on the left side of the track. It narrowly misses a large advertising billboard and just whacks into the trees on the side of the track. And all of this is on television, is on live television. All in all, the car goes more than 320 feet airborne. It hits the ground in the woods in this spot where, luckily, a bunch of trees had been cleared out a few weeks before. He's around 290, maybe 300 feet from the trackside. The car lands miraculously. Like the first piece of luck was the not hitting the Marshall stand or the board or anything else. The second piece of luck was that, again, there were no spectators in this part of the track. The third piece of luck is that the car lands somehow floor first in this giant cloud of dust, just throws dirt everywhere, but it hits so hard, the energy of the hit makes it roll over completely, right? A tree limb ends up spearing through the tub next to the cell, the fuel cell. The car stops right side up, and Dumbreck later talked about it. He said the thing just instantly lifted off. He had his eyes open, and he remembers thinking about how close he could get to the Toyota. Naturally, Ross, it's made me think of you when I read this. There's this moment where he's like, I was thinking about, well, okay, they said don't follow, but how close can you get? How close do we get? And when we get close enough, when's the front downforce start to go away? And then he clips the apex boom cars in the air, right? He had his eyes open. He said he saw sky, and then he was like, well, we're screwed. And he puts his arms to his head, and I can't do a Scottish brogue. He puts his arms to his head. He is waiting for the impact. And he said he just saw a blur just spinning, just black and white and green and black and white and green and black and white and green. When the car's landed and done, he is unconscious. He gets out of the car awake. The marshals and the gendarmerie, the local police, they find him there, just kind of standing around. But his first memory he said he doesn't remember anything before them carrying him out on a stretcher. And so at the end of that lap, at 8:49 local time, basically about a minute or two later, the last CLR on the track is ordered into the garage by the team. The team closes the garage doors, and they are done. Somebody calls Weber to tell him about Dumbrick, Mark Weber, and he says this in his autobiography. He broke into tears on the phone, which I don't know. I read that, and then I read that sentence again, and then I read that a third time, and like, what that must have felt like. Dumbrick he's given a breathalyzer by the French police. This odd quirk of the situation because it's technically a public road accident. Because remember that trunk road, Mulsanne, the Strait, is a piece of public road in France, and French law stipulates that all accidents on public roads must be breathalyzed. The participants must be breathalyzed after. Dumbrick goes to the hospital. He's cleared. He's basically untouched. Mercedes stops all endurance racing. And to this day, Hoig later said, the team director, he said, responsibility lies with us. There was a driving condition we did not have fully in our hands, and the people in charge of the racing team deserve criticism. We have not solved this problem. I found this interesting too. Dumbrick said that he later said, it did change me. He said, I didn't realize it for a while, but had a mental effect on me for a few months. He calls it cringeworthy stuff, and quote, generally all in Japan, which is just says worlds, right? Like racing drivers doing cringeworthy stuff that has nothing to do with race cars in Japan. Just like so many possibilities. But he starts taking chances in cars and risks. And like he just generally takes a long time to process it. The tech side of it, there are studies in the wake of this. In December of 1999, a few months later after the race, 3 individuals at the Center for Automotive Research in the United Kingdom, they published a research paper on how slipstreaming impacts the sports prototype racing cars. March of 2000, a few months later, they published another paper. It's titled On the Aerodynamic Stability of a Le Mans Prototype Race Car Under Off-Design Pitch Conditions, which I don't know about you, but that's catnip. I want to read that shit. Excuse me, I said it again. Both of those were directly related to the CLR accidents. And they basically concluded that they came up with some numbers that everybody had long known in the business, but we hadn't had anything to put on. Slipstreaming drafting can reduce the downforce of a following vehicle by up to 30%, depending on the distance, 16% reduction of drag for the vehicle following. They concluded the damper settings matter in these cases, but aren't going to save it. The FIA and the ACO made investigations. The results weren't public. Mercedes reportedly, they will not talk about this, but they reportedly went testing out the yin yang to try and figure it out. And if they came to any conclusions, they didn't release them. There was some discussion as to whether a small moment of contact that Dumbrick had with a Porsche a few minutes before on the same lap had damaged the car, whether it damaged the front of the car because it was Mercedes front to rear of the Porsche or side of the Porsche, I don't remember. But there was some discussion as to whether if you damaged the front of the car, Porsche was damaged enough that it had to slow down. Dumbrick didn't slow, but maybe it did something, pulled front downforce off, lost dive planes. The footage is so blurry that you can't see. And of course, naturally after that, the car was a big bag of bits. Whatever the reason, it was a landmark moment. The hump in the Mulsanne, that little rise that tripped off 2 of the accidents, they shaved it down in 2001. And if you can, there's a picture online of, and I found it's in one of the books I've got too, of one of the bulldozers there when they are shaving the hump. And I'd always seen it on TV. I was like, oh yeah, it's a little rise in the track, like boom, boom, car up and over. But the bulldozer next to it, the bulldozer is basically at track height of the track they're pulling it down to, pulling the pavement down to. And the pavement rise is almost up to the top of the cab of the bulldozer. It was a big hump. And
Sam, I thought you were going to say that the bulldozer got air and flipped over.
Yes, it was a big hump, and that's how my porn career started, bulldozers and air. So in the wake of this, a couple of cool things happens, right? Cool things happen. The FIA changes the regulations for prototypes, in part influenced by probably secret studies, but also those papers. Mandates center of pressure changes, mandates, those vents over the front wheels Jeff talked about. And what I find really interesting, really, really caps this, is how Mercedes reacted. So A, big, confident, old, powerful company, deeply conservative. But after this moment, yeah, okay, they didn't go back to endurance racing. But they, as far as I know, they have not shown the cars in public since. There's one in private hands, but they haven't really been run. The CLR has been virtually absent from all official factory publications, productions, anything they talk about in the company's history of endurance racing. That there are timelines at media events or public events that just have a gap right where that thing is. They talk about the CLK, but not that. And Jeff, you raise a finger. Yeah.
I think everybody runs it down. Well, not everybody runs it down, but people, they don't show it. And like you were saying, and I would like to see the safety and cockpit design of that car for those three drivers to essentially walk away from those accidents. And, we're talking pre-Hans device. We're talking, I mean, man, those things must have been pretty. I mean, the leg protection and they were flipping around and hitting and tumbling, and the cockpit design that was a pretty darn safe car by definition, I think.
Right, and that's what's so interesting about any car company that isn't from the culture you're from, right? Or any company or any creative culture that isn't from the same one as you, same land as you, same culture as you. I look at this and I think they screwed up, but also, and they made a mistake to run the cars again, but in the end, no one was hurt miraculously. It was one of those giant learning moments, and it shows the fallibility and the ability of a group of people to turn around and come back. But instead, they look at it. Germans just see that sort of thing differently, and there are thousand threads to pull there and talk about it. But Mercedes even went to the length of immediately revoking, in the wake of Le Mans, every worldwide official license to any maker of model cars to make models of the thing.
Really?
Which is why if you see a model of the CLR on the open market now, it'll be on eBay or Etsy or wherever, it is either off license and illegal, or it is very, very old and was built in period in the 6 or 9, I guess it would have been handful of months, less than 6 months, fewer than 6 months before the car ran and flipped. And they are naturally deeply valuable and trade hands for a lot of money. But then there are some rumors that Mercedes-Benz compensated the model car manufacturers because of course they did. It seems very Mercedes, but just the notion that they kind of went scorched earth with it.
And how many of those did they build? Race cars?
The cars?
Yeah.
So there's some. It's hard to find hard numbers, in part because again whatever information that was out there has been kind of clammed up. So there were the 3 cars that ran at Le Mans. There was the spare tub, and then it's known that there were at least 2 more. And there's one for a long time. There was one sitting in the lobby at I don't remember, it was either HWA or AMG, and there is one in private hands, but they are supposedly the number 4 car that was crashed was then rebuilt and is now kept by Mercedes. But it's one of those things where like all the books on the subject can't even point out, there were 7 tubs. Like even that stuff hasn't gotten out. And then
so there's none running in historic races or anything like that. That's no way.
There's there's definitely one that's appeared at lapping events somewhere. There are pictures of it online, but I don't know the background on it. I'm sorry.
Wow, that's cool.
Yeah. So the footnote to all this is, this was not the last giant flip, right? You mentioned one of us earlier, the Jeff Ross mentioned the BMWs at Petit Le Mans in 2000. Bill Auberlin, one of the BMW factory drivers, flipped one of the cars from that same class, the V12 LMR, at Petit Le Mans on the rise in the back straight. It's a different crash, very different car, but the reasons are similar. And as we know, prototypes haven't been designed the same way since. We learn, but we don't always learn quickly,
It takes something like that. Some of them, there was the era where they were getting sideways.
Yeah.
And then flipping that way. And that's why we have the big fins on the back of the car now, and the holes in the because we have holes on top of the tires in the front and the rear to let that air spill out. Because they were getting sideways and, and flipping over. Indy cars even had problems with that, right? And now they have NASCAR. Look at NASCAR. They have roof flaps and cowl flaps and things like that open up when they get sideways or backwards. So it's a thing. Aerodynamics are pretty powerful.
And so we've learned a lot. I mean, Road Atlanta shaved that little hill on the back straight as well. So the tracks have improved. Engineering on the car design, all that stuff has improved. They haven't done sort of too many MRIs on the brains of drivers who have made the decisions of, I'm going to get back in that car and drive it. And fortunately, I think that's the human part of the sport, where I hope they don't come along and go, hey, drivers, you have to pass some mental test before you're able to get back in the car.
Drivers passing a mental test, we would have 0 candidates left.
I know. Yeah. Thanks, Jeff.
I'm including you, Ross.
There's a trend there.
Right. There's definitely a trend.
I love, there's a piece on, it was on Motorsport or Autosport, one of the sites, I don't remember which, talking to one of the reserve drivers. I think it was Darren Turner, where they're talking to him, and he was set to get in the car when Webber went back out, if Webber didn't go out. Meaning, if Webber decided after first flip, no, he was going to get in the car, and it would have been Darren Turner in the car instead of Mark Webber in the second flip. And he thinks about it, and he's like, tells the reporter, he's like, oh, okay, that would have been my first ever lap at Le Mans, and I would have gone up, and my first ever yada, yada, yada. And he said, but at the same time, you're sitting there after the thing happens, and you're like, well, I mean, do I say no to a factory ride at Le Mans, in a prototype? Of course not. Win? No. I mean, who does, right? What would it take? What would it take to get you to say no? Silence. Silence.
The reason it's silence is because we're all going, I don't think there's anything it would take to get me to say no.
Right?
So I'm going to say at some point in my career, my answer would have been, it would depend on the team.
Really? Was that early or late in your career?
Early to mid in my career.
Okay.
But if Mercedes said, drive the car, no brainer.
Right.
If Audi, if Porsche, BMW, if, any of these big teams, it'd be like Roger Penske saying, hey, do you want to drive my car? No, thanks. I don't trust you.
It might be unsafe. Right.
Yeah. Now, there are other teams who don't have the same standards. And I think there are drivers. I mean, Webber actually said no to Mercedes at one point, right?
Yeah.
So I do think that drivers, there is a limit. But if Mercedes is asking, it's a no-brainer. You're in.
Yeah.
I love how the sport somehow simultaneously holds this completely logical process for decision making and people getting smarter and people learning things, going faster. And yet at the same time, it holds this completely illogical way of thinking that almost always ends up in people doing rad stuff for dumb reasons or dumb stuff for rad reasons. And maybe it works out, maybe it doesn't. Yep. But either way, it's all in the same box.
And rad things for rad reasons too.
And rad things are rad reasons, yeah.
Right.
So that, after yet another I said I wasn't going to try and do 2 hours. We shouldn't do more 2-hour episodes, but also if you made it this far, hooray and thank you. I don't know.
You're sorry. Like us. You keep pushing on no matter what.
Right. Dumb things for dumb reasons. Oh, okay. So that's a good way we should end the show. Which means I should probably give you a note on sources. Yeah. So we used a number of sources on this one, including period media coverage, but there are a few critical pieces that I think you might want to check out if you get time because they're fun. First one is the book Mercedes-Benz CLR by a German guy named Martin Mahler. Doesn't have a lot of information in it, but what's in there is really good and interesting, plus a bunch of neat pictures. Second one is Mark Webber's autobiography. It's called Aussie Grit because of course it is, because Mark Webber, I don't know, he probably wrote half of it with a pen in the cleft of his chin because he's just that kind of guy. And the third one is a Motorsport magazine interview, The Green Book, with Webber from July of 2015. It's worth a read. The guy's career is really interesting. He's one of those dudes who, again, just has zero filter and gets straight to the point. Talks about his whole life leading up to that crash and a crash that happened after it, and then his time in F1, and really interesting talk about, there's a period where he branches off into talking about like how he couldn't wrap his head around certain parts of the car and like tires he couldn't feel. Really interesting stuff that F1 drivers don't usually talk about. But guys, if you're good, I think now I have to read us out.
Go.
Okay.
Go.
It's Not the Car is written and produced by the people you heard on this episode and also one person you didn't hear. I'm the show's creator. The one and only Mike Perlman is our executive producer. And today, I feel like describing him in terms of race cars I've driven. So I'm just going to call the guy a cross between a Formula V and a Porsche 962 and that cardboard box that I drew over with a Sharpie when I was like 8 years old and climbed into and then pretended the whole thing was a GTP car. I'm a giant dork. And I'm not any different from when I was 8. For more on bonus content, perks, future live events, random ramblings from me, sometimes I write things on this thing, you can subscribe to our free newsfeed at patreon.com/notthecar. Side note, the free newsfeed does not actually have a lot in it. It's mostly just previews. If you like this episode and you'd like to support what we do here, conveniently, that also, you could also get access to the newsfeed that has things in it. Check out that same Patreon link and click Become a Member. If you're enjoying the show, please leave a review and share it with anyone you know who might enjoy it. Also share it with people who don't enjoy it. Just be that person. Put the joy into the world. Your recommendations make a huge difference, and they really do help us keep It's Not the Car on the air. As always, thank you for listening.
Have fun.
Have fun.
And keep your wheels on the ground.
Or don't. Send it.